Thank you all so much for joining us today. Welcome to our Shift Happens panel, Virus to Vaccine. I am really excited to be joined by four incredible panelists and our moderator today for this fourth installment of our Shift Happens webinar. We will be talking about what it takes to go from a virus to a vaccine. How do we eliminate the spread of COVID-19 through a vaccine? I am Hannah Taylor. I'm Global Health Corps' Director of Community Impact, and it's my honor today to introduce our moderator, Cassidy Howell. So Cassidy is a GHC alumna from our 2017-2018 cohort. Cassidy has worked as a public health practitioner looking at disease surveillance and pandemic preparedness in West Africa, Guinea, and Malawi. And currently, she is working as the Senior Associate at the Sabin Vaccine Institute on initiatives to accelerate the development of a universal influenza vaccine and exploring how COVID-19 is shaping vaccine R&D for diseases with pandemic potential. So Cassidy will be introducing our panelists and moderating today's discussion on what it'll take to develop, test, and market, as well as deliver a vaccine, and what are some of the challenges we may be experiencing in this process, including access to the vaccine and uptake within our community. So Cassidy, I want to give a warm thank you and welcome as our moderator for joining us today and sharing your own experiences at the Sabin Vaccine Institute. So I will pass it over to you to introduce yourself and our panelists. Welcome.
There we go. Hi, everyone. You think after this many months I would be proficient in Zoom. But thank you for that introduction. As Hannah mentioned, I'm Cassidy Howell. I'm working with the Sabin Vaccine Institute, and I'm really interested in learning from this COVID-19 experience and what we can sustain and learn to prevent future pandemics and hopefully respond better. But I am pleased to introduce our four panelists today. Joining us is Dr. Christopher Fang. Dr. Fang is the Vice President and General Manager of IQVIA R&D Solutions, and previously he served as the Worldwide Vice President of Strategic Medical Affairs and Medical Sciences at TPUI, the spine and trauma of Johnson & Johnson companies. Dr. Fang has also worked with multiple pharmaceutical companies on global clinical development and medical products. He also serves several degrees, including an MD, an MPH, and an MBA. Dr. Fang has also trained in general surgery and medical informatics. So that's Dr. Fang from our industry side. We've also got Michello Simuyandi, who's joining us from Lusaka. He is an infectious disease researcher with experience in vaccine clinical trials, community intervention trials, and scientific research over the last 10 years. Currently, he is the laboratory lead scientist and co-founder of the Enteric Disease and Vaccine Research Unit and a research fellow at the Center for Infectious Disease Research in Zambia, or CITRS. So thank you to Michello for joining us all the way from Lusaka. We've also got Sarah Snidel. Is she with us? Okay, great. So Sarah is joining us from Kampala, Uganda, where she is the manager of new vaccine introduction and service delivery on CHAI's global vaccine delivery team, where she provides technical support on strategic program design for HPV, polio, and COVID-19 vaccination programs, including on decisions to introduce and opportunities to accelerate reaching target coverage. Sarah is a GHC alumna from the 2014-2015 cohort, where she served with LifeNet International in Bujumbura, Burundi. So thank you, Sarah. And we've also got Naim Kogan, who joins us from Olympia, Washington. He is an epidemiologist, infectious disease researcher, and health advocate. Vadim is now working as an immunization health educator for the Washington State Department of Health. Vadim is now overseeing a program to improve vaccination rates in underserved populations. He also supports the Community Engagement Task Force for Washington State's emergency COVID-19 response. And like myself, Vadim is a GHC alum from the 2017-2018 cohort, where he served at the Ministry of Health in Malawi. So thank you to everybody for joining us. Why don't we go around to each of you and just please share a little bit about your work in vaccine programming. Where does your work fit in with the cycle of development, access to uptake, and how has COVID-19 impacted your work in vaccine programming? So why don't we start with you, Dr. Fang?
Hello. Okay, good. Now we're able to unmute ourselves. So good morning, good afternoon. I'm Christopher Fang. As introduced earlier, I'm part of the IQVIA organization, which is currently the world's leading largest contract research organization. We conduct clinical research on behalf of large pharma and small biotech company. So in that capacity, IQVIA as an organization currently conducts more than 100 COVID studies that includes trials for diagnosis, trials for treatment, as well as vaccine trials. And as an organization, without revealing sort of confidential client information, we are involved with a few of the largest vaccine trial right now. And so we do have, so I would say, firsthand experience and information on how things are going with this race to getting a vaccine approved and available for everyone around the globe. So, so delighted to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Great, thank you so much. So, Michello, you are also working in research. Could you please share with us your experience working with CIDRs?
Hi, everyone. So thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel. What we do, and I'll just talk about the current things we do at the Enteric Disease and Vaccine Research Unit. We are a platform that is being used for screening and testing vaccines and or candidate vaccines. And we have experience in doing, from phase 1 through to phase 3, and even post-licensure kind of studies for vaccine evaluation. We have experience beginning with rotavirus vaccine, which we, as an organization through our unit, helped really championed the introduction of rotavirus vaccination in the EPI for children in Zambia. And then we also worked on oral cholera vaccine, which we have embedded in the National Elimination Program targeting cholera hotspots in the country. And then currently working with enterotoxigenic E. coli and Shigella vaccines. And we currently have phase 1, phase 2 trials that are going on. But because it's a platform and the impact of COVID, we are also planning already as a site for COVID vaccines as and when they are available for testing. I mean, we're excited to see how we can apply the experience to the other vaccine evaluations and work to see how it would apply to COVID. And the dynamic, I think now with COVID and the disruption in terms of access to communities and also travel, I think it's both an opportunity and a challenge. And I think that with the lessons that we've learned so far and the collaborations that have been developed, I think it's going to be an exciting time ahead.
Great, thank you for sharing. I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing what your site is doing to prepare for this new vaccine. So I'm going to move to Sarah. It would be great to hear more about your work with CHAI as you also prepare for vaccine introduction in the areas you work in.
Hi, sorry, having some tech difficulties on my side. Apologies about that. So I work with Clinton Health Access Initiative, CHAI, as you mentioned. We have vaccine programs in a number of countries, and we work across the spectrum of vaccine introduction support. So we do have a team that also focuses on the market side, but for me personally, I'm on our global vaccine delivery team. And what we do is we support countries with the end-to-end rollout of introduction. So that starts with the discussion around, in terms of health priorities, should you be introducing a vaccine? How does it weigh against other opportunities that the country may have in terms of either other vaccines and potentially other health priorities? What are the feasibility and readiness challenges that you might encounter as you're rolling out a vaccine, and all the way down to the actual preparation and implementation through to when has the vaccine reached target coverage, as well as supporting on service delivery improvements. One of the key pieces of our work here is also talking about the global policy influencing, about how can the global sector, so whether it's Gavi or WHO, support countries when they're going through their vaccine introduction processes. And critically for COVID, what's important here is, because we know timelines have been incredibly condensed, is rather than having 15 years sort of from when this development starts to develop then what recommendations and guidance is out there in terms of should countries introduce, what's the weight compared to other opportunities, we're now condensing it to less than a year. And so countries are being forced to think basically in a matter of weeks rather than a matter of months or years about what their opportunity to introduce is. And so for our work right now, we're talking a lot with the global sector about how can they better produce guidance in a rapid turnaround to countries, as well as engage countries, particularly low and middle income countries who can't develop their own vaccines because they don't have the facilities available to access the vaccine, and then make the decision about rolling it out and getting it to the end beneficiary.
Great, thank you. So just a few things.
Just a couple.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's great to hear more about your work. And Vadim as well, so on the US side, you've been working with the State Health Department on vaccine education and uptake. Can you tell us a little more about your experience and what you've seen with vaccine hesitancy in communities in the US? Clearly, this is quite a broad issue, and people have different reasons for hesitancy based on the disease and the population, but can you speak to your experience there?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Naim Kogan. I'm working for the Washington State Department of Health in their Center for Public Affairs in partnership with the Office of Immunizations on a vaccine hesitancy project, the first of its kind in the state. And in general, just before I go into detail on some of the work that I've been doing, the state has been responding to COVID-19. Seattle and the Seattle area had the first known case in the United States. And so the emergency response towards COVID has been going on for a while. And there are some lessons that we've learned from that experience. And I have served on some of that emergency response as well. In general, for vaccine hesitancy, the populations that we've been focusing on are immigrant and refugee populations, people that haven't been necessarily given services or haven't been targeted by DOH in the past. Those people usually are coming from their own life experiences, other countries, other past experiences that may or may not have been positive when it came to vaccinations or the health system in general. So we do know that a large factor in terms of people having good outlook on vaccinations is trust in their government officials or trust in medical establishment. especially in the United States. We also know that in terms of reaching out to those populations, you want to be able to reach out to them where they are, not to only do outreach during an emergency, but have those community connections, have those building blocks set up before something like COVID hits. And if you do have to do that at the time, you want to make sure you do that in a sustainable way and build those connections with community leaders, health providers serving the community or who are from the community, so that they can also translate your messaging to the community in an equitable way. As well as making sure you have a good idea of the landscape so that you can do equitable outreach and make sure you're not missing populations that are in need. And so a lot of that work has been what we've been doing for the COVID response as well, not just around vaccinations, but just trying to get messaging around COVID to those populations. This last piece of around vaccine hesitancy is coming up more recently now that the vaccine is further along in development. And it's still an emerging issue that we're currently working on. So I can't speak directly to vaccine hesitancy around COVID vaccine because we don't have a vaccine yet to administer. But in terms of my work, a lot of my work is around uptake. So issues around uptake or around vaccine hesitancy are things that I have been working on.
Great, thank you, Vadim. Thanks to all of you for sharing a little more specifically about how your work has been impacted by COVID. So I'm gonna head back upstream and talk to Michello and Dr. Fang about the early stages, the development stages. So you both are involved in the clinical research and testing for vaccines or supporting the clinical research. And now that this pandemic, has been widely rampant throughout the world, shutting down society, everyone is insistent, of course, on the need for a vaccine immediately. And some even noting that it could be available in November, which is less than a year after the virus was identified. Now, there have been really incredible scientific collaborations, new investments, and really innovative, streamlined regulatory processes that have accelerated vaccine development in record time. But given your work in vaccine research and development, how realistic do you think it is that a safe and effective vaccine will be available in the next several months? Can you help our community understand better what are the steps that need to be taken to ensure a safe and effective vaccine? So Dr. Fang, I'll start with you. You can respond to that.
Certainly. So, there's been a lot being said and publicized about vaccine development. And fortunately and unfortunately, because we're in an election cycle, a lot of that's being politicized. That being said, though, I would emphasize the fact that in the key players were sort of leading this effort. Mainly, you think about the major pharma, which would be Pfizer, AstraZeneca, J&J. They each have a program that's entering into late phase development. And you have sort of innovative biotech companies such as Moderna. So I think there are 4 vaccines candidates right now that's entering late phase in U.S. And last night, I've been counting all the effort that's being done outside of the U.S. right now. And certainly, many of these players or companies have secure funding from U.S. government to scaled up manufacturing at risk. Typically, that's not what would be done. You do things sequentially because the cost involved, and then the trial as well too. You wait longer because the risk of the investment needed on the company, but because the government have essentially de-risked that entire situation by giving them all the funding, so they're speeding things up more than usual, and a lot of part of it is because we as a taxpayer is paying for it, and that's why. In terms of availability, I think we need to delineate between what has been said in terms of we'll know something about whether or not the vaccine works versus a vaccine will actually be approved by a regulatory agency, manufacturer, deliver to, and operationally to the place needed, and then also be given to the individuals, right? So a lot of steps will have to happen. So I think a lot of discussion has been focused on the fact that will we know that we have a vaccine that actually works? I mean, it's probably theoretically possible given the timelines of trials that's being conducted right now. We know that sometime by the end of the year that whether or not that we have a vaccine candidate that actually works. I think that's very different than saying that, and we have a vaccine that will have all the safety profiles, and so understanding the fact that getting any drug or vaccine approved requires both the efficacy and safety profile to meet the regulation, and so being very focused on talking about efficacy, but one of I think AstraZeneca's trial was briefly put on hold in U.S. because safety issue. Now I think it's back and running, and there was another one that was put on hold as well too recently. So understanding that's something completely different. Then after that, you have to be able to produce at a large quantity with the quality that's required, make sure that's distributed to all the places. So there's been discussion about the fact that different vaccines may have different storage requirements, which also makes it challenging. There are also differences in these different vaccine candidates, whether or not you get 1 versus 2 doses, right? Whether or not 1 dose is enough versus you need 1 plus a booster dose, which will mean that maybe the trial will take longer. And so without that, in the background, I think it's just important for me to remind everyone to be educated and be sort of be a good reader in the sense that understanding what you're reading and the source of which you're reading, and really make that sort of educated insight judgment on your own in terms of the situation. I would say that just because we're involved, that I'm relatively confident that one of the compounds or what the candidates will work out by the end of the year. And in terms of the exact timeline when that will be available to everyone, there's a lot of other variables that's in play before that we know that for sure.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's like anything in science, I feel like from discovery to development, it's not just a straight line. There's always going to be issues to address. And I think when you mentioned the de-risking the environment, that seems to be a really critical factor, especially for vaccine development, which is usually considered pretty high risk, and manufacturing at risk is really enabled there to be a lot of horses in the race, which is what we need because we don't anticipate that everyone will reach the finish line. So we need a lot of options very quickly. So thank you for that perspective. So I'll then head back to Michello. What are your thoughts on how realistic and safe an effective vaccine will be in the next coming months? And what do you think, or what are the steps to getting us there? What do you see as maybe any barriers that exist to clinical trials for these vaccines, and what is CIDRS doing to prepare for this?
Oh, thank you. I would follow up from what Dr. Fang has said, that it's one thing for you to get the product cleared, say in phase 3, and we say it's efficacious, but how it performs in the actual population is also a different thing. What I would say from the outset is that we have a system that we have used to produce other vaccines. And I think that we are not starting from scratch. So that's a plus. There's acceleration because of resources and collaboration. I think those are pluses which we have here, and learning our previous experiences. I'll give you an example of if we say we have a vaccine ready in November, hypothetically, the question one would want to ask is, have we tested that in an African population? If we give an example of our experience with rotavirus vaccines, is that the current Rotarix vaccines have been, in the 85-90% efficacy in higher income countries, and really below 50% efficacious in the African population. And as we have noted in terms of the way the epidemic has actually spread, Africa doesn't have the staggering numbers you talk about, Italy and all those things. So understanding how, if we have a candidate in November that the US says they would deploy, if we don't know how that would perform in an African context, that is something that I feel would be ambitious for us to say, then we have this is a magic bullet. We would have to be able to get how this thing performs in different contexts. And the plus again to this is that, for example, WHO through the Solidarity Network, we have the CoVPN, which was the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, which we are part of, is also working. And then we also have the CDC through the Africa CDC, for example, where we are getting lower middle income countries as sites and trying to test these candidate vaccines almost simultaneously in these different populations and settings. So I think that for me is a very good plus. And I think that we have to get around some of those hopes for us to be able to say we would be able to get it. So it will be quicker than other vaccines, but I would not want to put a date to it because, what happens, we've seen vaccines that, would perform well in phase 3, deploy them, they don't do well. And I think that we also have to be clear about what are the set points. If we are saying we just need it to be 30% efficacious and the strategy is to vaccinate a lot of people, then the issue is that how do we get them to vaccinate those people? Let's give an example of, say, we have a 2-dose vaccine. From my standpoint, I'll give an example of a cholera vaccine, which you need to deploy in an emergency setting 14 days apart. Would you be able to marshal enough resources to go into an area, vaccinate, come back, regroup, and then revaccinate? So there are those practical things that we need to be able to look at and see whether we can be able to deliver those things. And the only advantage, I'll still come back to this, is that we have different situations and settings where we have tried. And I think if we can learn from what has happened in the past, I think we will be better placed for us to move as quickly as possible. But we need to be very clear that as we make optimistic pronouncements, we should be alive to some of these hitches which we need to overcome.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I really appreciate you reminding us that, this has been such a fast effort, but it wasn't that anybody was starting from scratch. It's been really inspiring to see how a lot of researchers and collaborators have leaned on their existing networks and knowledge from HIV vaccine learnings. I know in the influenza space, a lot of the researchers and biotechs that are now really advancing COVID vaccines were also working previously on accelerating universal influenza vaccines. So it's great to see how those technologies can be leveraged for in this experience and what we can still learn from COVID to continue those efforts. I think that also, like you said, Marcello, it's important to communicate the different processes because it isn't a straight line of like, okay, we have everything developed and then we can immediately push it out to the whole world. There's clearly a lot of factors involved in that. And so I'd say it's really important to manage expectations and transparently communicate this process to the public. I know at least in the States, we've had a lot of people, the public being frustrated when guidelines change, but we need to normalize updating the information with the evidence as it becomes available. It's a completely novel virus, so we're kind of building the plane as we're flying it, as Peggy Hamburg, former FDA commissioner, has said. Not meeting these ambitious timelines isn't necessarily a bad thing. It means that issues were addressed and that no corners are being cut on safety before delivering a vaccine to the public. So I even know a lot of experts are trying to manage expectations that a vaccine might not necessarily mean we'll be able to eliminate the virus altogether. So just, again, encouraging the importance of communicating to the public, fostering public trust is essential every step of the way, because even if we can develop a vaccine, we need people to take it. So that will be a good transition to back to our downstream uptake community here. So now let's say what happens when we have a vaccine? It's safe, it's effective. What is the potential for the global production and effective supply chains to deliver it in a timely way? There's not really a scenario where a new vaccine needed by billions of people immediately isn't a scarce resource, but logistically speaking, Sarah, I think you've touched on this topic. So what are the challenges in the contexts you're working in regarding distribution and access of this vaccine, and what initiatives or strategies may be employed to overcome them, such as the kovacs model? I think that's pretty fascinating.
Sure, yeah. So starting at that global level with the kovacs facility, I think both Dr. Fang and Marcello have touched on a number of important points related to the issue of getting it together. But the kovacs facility is a global collaboration that's attempting to solve some of these problems. So essentially what they've done is they've made a commitment to attempt to get about 2 billion doses as early as possible to distribute, not just to the high-income countries, but to ensure equitable access to lower and middle income countries as well. And so they have set up what's called the AMC 92. So that's the Advanced Market Commitment countries. And these are 92 countries they've identified that are either low income or lower middle income and need additional support. And so these will have access to subsidized pricing of the vaccine as it becomes available, to make sure that it reaches beyond just the high income countries who can pay a lot, like the US is planning on doing. The intention then is to get 2 billion doses available out to all of the COVAX countries, which are these 92 countries, plus a handful of upper middle income and high income countries who have signed on. The list of high income countries is still currently confidential, but is expected to be released soon as they're doing final negotiations. But it's quite a large subset of countries. And at my last count, I believe was about between 40 and 60 countries with high income status had joined in. And so they'll be helping to subsidize some of the cost of the antigen itself. And so the COVAX facility is nice because, as I believe it was perhaps Dr. Fang mentioned and Marcello a bit as well, a lot of vaccines still fail in phase 3. We have a lot of hope for vaccines being ready, but I tend to estimate that about 80% of vaccines that make it into phase 3 are not going to be effective on the market. And so the idea here is that if they've not identified just a couple of vaccines to invest in, but a whole bunch of vaccines, and they've given, I believe it's near 30, if not above 30, and they've given them research and development funds, regardless of whether or not the vaccine is successful, to help accelerate the process of getting this to market. And then with that, they're hoping to get the vaccine to market for low and middle income countries as early as March or April of next year. I've seen one scenario which says maybe as early as February. I think that's quite ambitious, as a couple of the other points have been mentioned. But the idea there then is to get it out as fast as possible. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of logistics that goes into this. And for a typical vaccine, I've seen most countries, when you're introducing a rotavirus vaccine, which is at the infant platform, take a minimum of 12 months to prepare for that introduction, because there's a lot of logistics in terms of getting various ministries involved, getting the awareness out there, training the healthcare workers and all of that. But for the HPV vaccine, we actually say, because it's a new platform, a new target cohort, you need a minimum of 24 months. And that's also because there are some supply challenges with HPV. And so we know to get this out now by April, that gives us about 6 months. And that's going to be quite the feat. But what's important here then when it comes to logistics is accelerating the other processes, which includes things like, for these 92 countries, what are they going to do to pay for all of the healthcare worker trainings? What are they going to do to pay for all of the things that it takes, like updating tools to get it rolled out? And typically the way that this would work is that a country would go to, particularly a lower middle income country, would go to Gavi and request a vaccine introduction grant. and co-financing support for the antigen. The co-financing is of course already solved. It'll be, well, not entirely solved. We haven't figured the exact amounts, but it'll be paid for through the COVAX facility with some support there and some commitment on the behalf of the country. And those figures should be coming out for country governments soon. But in terms of the vaccine introduction grant, the process to apply there, because it has to go through funding approvals, in itself can take 6 to 12 months. And so right now the global community is working on how do we accelerate the release of those grants and getting targeted country assistance to help countries to accelerate these processes. But the first step here, I'd say, is simply around the decision making. Michelle mentioned there's a lot of, there's discrepancy between countries in terms of what the burden of COVID actually is. And particularly as countries, I typically live in Uganda, and so I tend to use Uganda as my example, but Uganda wants to start opening up its economy now. It's made some massive strides to start moving open the economy, which means that the spread of COVID will be increasing. But on the flip side, we also see that maybe the death rate has not been as high in Uganda. We're not sure, but they've also done severe lockdown measures to try and control it. So how does the country, with such limited information, we don't know what the vaccine looks like, we don't know what the actual burden of COVID is, or if it should be a priority given the burden, how do you make that decision? So the first step, I'd say, is countries need to start thinking about, first, do they want to introduce the vaccine? How does it weigh against other health priorities? And then the next step is, do they want to do that through the COVAX facility? Which for most low and middle income countries, I would guess is yes, but it depends a bit on their own manufacturing abilities.
Great, thank you for giving us a rundown on that. You would hope that the high income countries would be supportive of the COVAX facility because, you know, the mantra of global health security is a virus anywhere is a threat everywhere. So after this pandemic, we've seen the economic and health costs of something like this. So I'm encouraged by seeing the COVAX facility, and I can only hope that a lot of countries get on board so that we can really deliver this at a global scale in an equitable fashion. So thanks for sharing your experience with that. I think it's really interesting. So what are some lessons, still with you, Sarah, what are some lessons your team has learned in effective vaccine programming, and how can global bodies support this?
Sure. So I tend to be an eternal optimist, a very realistic optimist here, in part because in order to move towards supporting this, we do need to think about the timeline as though it's going to be as early as possible to start testing what our thoughts might be. The reality is we're not going to have 2 billion doses in March. The 2 billion doses is going to be spread out over a time frame that might start rollout in March. And so the lessons we've learned is, one, start with a robust decision-making process. I know I said that before, but I'm really into decision-making processes, but you want to get a bit more in depth than you typically might with another one. So this is weighing out what's your impact and feasibility of introducing, and going beyond your usual thinking about impact. Typically, we look at a life saved opportunity against cost, as well as some other feasibility metrics such as trading and that sort of thing. And so what we want to do as either global partners or national level country partners is start thinking about how can you help countries to think through the decision-making process. So outlining what are the major impact considerations you have. Is there an impact of COVID lockdown measures that you want to maintain, such as impacts on education? We wouldn't normally think about that on a vaccine introduction, but you want to think about it here. And then when it comes to feasibility, you want to go back to the foundations of feasibility and thinking about what the factors there are. And typically these are things like, what's the political will for introducing? What are your other health priorities? What's your availability of resources? What's the vaccine acceptability? What's the registration and regulation process, and how much supply is available or will you need? But for COVID, you want to put a different lens on it. Thinking about it specifically from the COVID lens, political will for HPV might be the First Lady is really involved in women's health issues and therefore she's going to be a champion. For COVID, the flip side might be, we don't actually know if there's a problem with COVID. There's been a lot of politicalization of the COVID itself, as well as the COVID vaccine. will that affect your ability to introduce? When it comes to the registration process, I forget who touched on it earlier, but this is going to be a massive challenge in countries, and we need to start thinking about it. So the US has the FDA, but typically in low and middle income countries, what you'll use is the WHO pre-qualified process, where they go through and vet vaccines. This includes often an emergency use authorization, but then countries have their own regulation, internal regulation processes. So doing a look across a bunch of countries that Chai works with, we identified that there's a handful that will be able to just use the emergency use authorization process that WHO uses, but we would also need to consider in country, how do we accelerate other processes? So it's a matter of the global partners looking at these impact and feasibility and asking where are things that we can help. So that's recommendations on how you can accelerate your regulation, for example, but also in country looking through and saying, what are the different features? How might it change depending on the product presentation of the vaccine that's coming out? And what can we do now to start solving this? And what do we need to essentially ask for? What are your no regret moves?
Great, thank you. So you've obviously mentioned the introduction into a community. And so I'll ask Vadim more about this and your experience. So a large part of your work, Vadim, is as an immunization health educator, is educating communities about vaccines and increasing uptake. So what are some of the challenges people may expect when a new vaccine is introduced? And maybe what are some of the steps that you take or some of the strategies you use on your team to address these issues kind of in preparation?
Thanks, Cassidy. So I think everything that people have said here is well and good. And if we do have a large supply of vaccine available that is safe and effective, we're definitely far down along the road of getting people vaccinated. But if people don't have, if there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy in the population, or people don't trust their officials or don't trust the information that's coming out of regulatory agencies like FDA or CDC or WHO, they're not going to get vaccinated. And it's going to be very difficult to get vaccine uptake to be as high as we need it to achieve overall immunity or to hopefully end the epidemic. So in terms of the work that we've been doing, I think one of the main things that's really important is to be able to get a pulse on the population that you're working with, on what people's knowledge, attitudes, and practices are around vaccination or around the specific disease that you're looking at. So for us, we've done focus groups around some of the populations that we'd worked with, came from interview questionnaires around providers that are serving the community or community leaders, to kind of just get an understanding of where the community is getting their information, their health information, what organizations they trust, how much trust they have in government agencies like our own or like other organizations that are giving, like providing vaccine messaging to the community. So the first step would be to understand that. And then the next step would be to figure out how to put together messaging and how to work with the community, build those partnerships to get people to be exposed to the messaging that you're trying to put into the community. You can pay for a large media campaign, but it won't matter if the community doesn't trust the organization that's saying that content. And we've seen that. We've seen uptake not change if you do a large campaign like this. So it is really important to build those connections and to understand what people are thinking around the disease that you're looking at. And of course, different diseases are going to be different. COVID, you can see every day in everyday life, people do want to get back to living their lives and not having to worry about this, but people have very strong concerns around vaccine safety and efficacy. So the main thing that I could say would be to understand what the community you're working with is thinking, where people are getting information, and then to build your outreach based on that and hand in hand with the community that you're working with.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's always so important. Thanks for the reminder to always be informing our messages and our communication with evidence, with data from the community, so that you're tailoring those messages to that group. I heard, trying to remember which group it was, but it's the COVID-19 survey research group, and they were mentioning they do all these work on surveys and collecting data, but sometimes whoever is in charge of the PSA public messaging, they might not get that data to that group. And then there's a commercial on TV using like fear tactics. And that's not always the most appropriate messaging. So backing up all of our communications with data and evidence and collecting that first is definitely the way to move forward. That's a great example of a best practice for that messaging. So thank you so much to all of you. Wow, I can't believe this time has gone by so quickly, but I appreciate all of these perspectives. I want to get to Q&A, but just for one, maybe last lightning round, on a positive note, I mean, we have seen really unprecedented scientific and really human achievement in this COVID-19 vaccine experience. Mike Osterholm, a renowned pandemic preparedness expert at CIDRAP, always says, you know, never waste a crisis. So my question to you is, in 30 seconds, maybe tell us what would be the one top lesson or strategy from the COVID-19 vaccine experience that we should sustain and carry forward to prevent or at least respond better to future pandemics. So why don't we start with Dr. Fang?
I think it all comes with the preparedness and collaboration. I think we need to anticipate better about potential impact of next pandemic and be ready for it. And also that I do see and agree that there is unprecedented level of collaboration, and people are not seeing, including the large players are agreeing to share safety data across different vaccine platforms. This doesn't normally happen, but people have agreed to do that. So I would say that, you know, be more prepared and continue to collaborate will be my biggest lesson learned from this time.
Thank you. And Marcello?
I would agree with Dr. Fang. The other thing for me is improving on the capacity to quickly develop diagnostics, because understanding your epidemic in your setting is really key for you to decide whether you want to go the vaccine way or not, and whichever other intervention you need to be able to do. And I think that, speaking from the challenges we've had as a lower or middle income country in terms of just accessing diagnostics and supplies, that's something I think we need to put at the back of our mind and see what we can do to invest in improving diagnostics.
Perfect, thank you. And Sarah?
Yeah, I really like this note on collaboration that's come out. I think it's been incredibly important, and I think that's the one I want to keep emphasizing. We need to keep collaborating, and whether that's about tech transfers to get vaccines scaled up and how fast they can go across manufacturing facilities, or if it's about making sure that we have equity to all countries. We've seen how quickly something like this can spread, and we got really lucky with COVID that there were vaccine trials that allowed us to leapfrog based on research that had been done. That may not be the case for the next pandemic, depending on what it is. And so we need to collaborate together, and we need to make sure there's equitable access for everybody, because it's great to rely on vaccines. I believe in vaccines, but we also need to collaborate when it comes to other control issues as well, and make sure that there is everything available to everybody, not just the high income countries.
Yeah, I'm hoping that these networks kind of maintain in the future, no matter what the health threat is, that we can sustain these relationships and networks. And Vadim?
Well, I was going to say collaboration, but everyone said that before me. So I'll try for a different thing as well. So that, yes, agreed.
Yes,
and I think also when we were responding to the pandemic here in Washington State, we also saw how important health education was in the context of a pandemic, and with shifting knowledge around how the pandemic was working, how to best protect the population from getting infected. So we had seen how important it was to get communication out to the population in a timely manner in a way that people would understand, and how that could scale. If people know, that they should be wearing masks when they're going to be within 6 feet of other people or outside, then they can help you when it comes to getting that message out to other people. And they could also help you get people to practice those things that you are trying to get them to practice. So we did see how important that was, and we had started to kind of understand that it's really important to keep that going and keep that type of education happening consistently, especially in the context of a emergency pandemic response.
Great, thank you. So we've got education, collaboration, investment in diagnostics. Appreciate that. And for any audience members, if you are working on COVID-19 vaccine response, my organization has just put out a survey trying to capture some of these lessons learned and how we can sustain this momentum for preventing future health threats. So we'll put the link in the little chat. But thank you so much. And yeah, I think we can open up to audience questions now.
Yes, thank you so much, Cassidy, and to our panelists. This is incredibly informative for me, and I can see a number of questions coming into the chat. So I will go ahead and field a few of those. I think anyone jump in if you have a thought on them. Some are specifically directed, but first we have a question from Jamie. Jamie says, interested in your perspectives on inclusion of pregnant women or other routinely disincluded subpopulations in COVID-19 vaccine trials. Health workers are projected to be early recipients in countries of COVID vaccines, and 70% of the global health workforce are women, many of childbearing age. So how are current developers viewing inclusion of pregnant women in COVID-19 vaccine trial eligibility criteria? So perhaps Dr. Fang, maybe we can start with you, and anyone else who might want to jump in, please feel free to share.
Yeah, so I have to get back on you on whether or not we're including pregnant women. That being said, there is a significant effort being done to make sure we include diverse populations in terms of different ethnicity and different sort of disease, sort of entities as well. So these trials are very large and global, and so yeah, I think most of the major pharma are very aware of these type of issues and making sure that whatever results we obtain is representative of the population we'll be serving long term. Yeah.
Just to add in on that, on a quick review of the products that are in later stages, indeed, I didn't see any that are currently including pregnant women. I may have missed one, but I think that is a gap, and I think it's a gap that we're aware of. Typically, vaccine trials won't include pregnant women because of potential further risks, and so this is a standard safety protocol. The one difference I think you're really seeing with this vaccine compared to other ones is that we are looking at older populations and other high-risk groups. It varies from vaccine to vaccine, but some have included older populations, some have them in specific trial groups. And this is important because after healthcare workers, we know that the subsequent populations will be higher risk groups either by age or some other comorbidity or other determination. And so I would say there's definitely consideration around how do we think about these high risk groups, which for pregnant healthcare workers, they would fall into that category. But I think manufacturers are bearing in mind the safety concerns, and typically trials on pregnant women come later due to potential risks and complications, and wanting to avoid that as much as possible.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fang and Sarah. And Michello, this was so much, I think your point throughout was that there's one thing about sort of efficacy, and there's a different piece about how that really is rolled out in populations. So I think this question really touches to so many parts of your conversation today. I want to make sure we move on to get a couple of the other questions in. Chelsea asks, due to the accelerated vaccine development process, I get the impression that we won't know how long immunity lasts by the time the vaccine is manufactured or distributed. Is that accurate? And can you speak to that? There's the one piece about getting it to people, but then the piece about immunity and what we learn in the process. So feel free to jump in.
So there are two parts to that, right? So there's a part about the efficacy of the vaccine itself, and there's the second part about the immunity of the population. So maybe I'll address the first part of it. So this vaccine is more like a flu vaccine rather than a polio vaccine. I think that is very important for people to understand that, whereas your polio vaccine, if you get 3 doses, you're essentially completely immune, 99% effective. This vaccine, most likely, we're looking at maybe 50 to 70% efficacy. We don't know yet. We're waiting to find out. And so it's a lot more like a flu vaccine, which most of us are very familiar, that, there's still a significant, relatively large percentage, even after you've been vaccinated, you could still get it. And so that's important to know. And then secondarily, that even if whatever efficacy we end up achieving with this vaccine, the percentage people will need required to have received this vaccine in order for us to obtain this what we call immunity on a population level. That's another question, right? So it's a significant public health question everyone's trying to answer and understand, and we really wouldn't know until we have a vaccine approved and available. It also makes a difference whether or not you get single dose versus if you need two doses as well too. So it's an important question, and it's I would say it's developing right now, and we're eager to find out the results of that.
Yeah, and just to say from a logistics side, we sort of expect that to keep developing. We will potentially roll out a vaccine without knowing if the immunity is beyond 6 months to 1 year. The WHO has put out a targeted product profile that states a minimum request. The preferred is 1 year, and the critical minimum threshold is 6 months. But you can roll out a vaccine and think that it only lasts for 6 months, and we can update the understanding and policy of that as we go. And this will be true for other things. The most challenging one from a logistics perspective is when we roll it out, we will only know if the vaccine has a shelf life of 3 months. But that would be updated as we go, as we understand if it's shelf stable for 3 years, which many vaccines are, but you can't update that without the time. And so some of this is a play off of urgency versus ability to know the answers.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that we are also kind of working in an emergency situation. And so there are certain classic things that we do in non-emergency situations, which is post-licensure surveillance, where you constantly monitor. And I think that we have mentioned around the systems that have been developed already. So if we are to deploy the vaccine today, doesn't mean that we will stop tracking the immunity, of this vaccine. We need to be able to track and say, how long does it sustain? So the trials and the studies do continue. And this is what I think, speaking to what Vadim had said about trusting the process, I think that the vaccine developer doesn't just get the vaccine once they've given it to the person, they keep quiet. We constantly follow these things up for a long period of time. So while we may not know now, I think we will, with time, constantly be checking and seeing how long the protection would.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions, but we are at time. And this has been such a rich and interesting discussion with each of you. I want to thank Cassidy for moderating and sharing her experience and work at Sabin, to Dr. Fang, to Michello, Vadim, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing with our community, sharing with the folks on the line here, all about your knowledge and experience working in the vaccine process and what it is going to take in our countries and in our communities to address COVID-19 with a vaccine. So I want to thank everyone here for joining the webinar. I know that you have likely found it a rich experience as I have. We ask that you please take the brief survey that'll pop up at the end once you close your Zoom, just to help us build out some future sessions. And just as a reminder that following the webinar, we will be sharing an overview of this conversation and resources for GHC alumni on the GHC community portal, and for others externally on our publication of Amplify. So thank you again to our panelists, to our moderators. It's been a wonderful time to be with you all. Thank you to everyone who's joined. Please do stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.